All right. So I am exceptionally happy today to introduce Dr. Devon Price. He is a social psychologist, professor, author, and proud autistic person. His research has appeared in journals such as the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, and the Journal of Positive Psychology. Dr. Price Dr. Price's writing has appeared in outlets such as the Financial Times, HuffPost, Slate, Jacobin, Business Insider, LitHub, and on PBS and NPR. He lives in Chicago, where he serves as an assistant professor at Loyola University, Chicago's School of Continuing and Professional Studies. And so I am very excited for you to join us today and talk a little bit about your book, Laziness Does Not Exist. So I think that for our community, it's particularly exciting because we hear a lot of people internalize this idea of laziness. And so maybe you could start out by talking a little bit about how you first became interested in the concept of laziness.
Yeah. So, as my bio kind of describes, in addition to being an academic, I'm also a disabled person, maybe in a slightly different way than most of the people in the audience, but lots of similarities, I think, because we're both autistic people, neurodivergent people, people with IH or sleep disorders. We're both spoonies, for those who are familiar with the term spoon theory, having sometimes unpredictable and very limited amounts of energy and energy needs that are sometimes not in alignment with what mainstream society expects for how much energy you should have, what should be draining for you, what you should be capable of, and all of those things. So, but I didn't know that until I was in my late 20s that I was autistic. I, like a lot of people of my generation, didn't fit the kind of stereotypical profile of a disabled person in the 90s at the time when children of my age would have been normally getting diagnosed. And so I was just kind of breezing through life, really leaning on the few skills that I did have and the areas of my life in which I did have capacities. So I struggled socially. I struggled with energy needs and being really drained from any kind of social interaction. But I was really good at academics. So, and I wanted to understand how human beings worked. So I studied psychology to kind of do the things that maybe non-autistic people do a little bit more intuitively, is just, talk to people and relate to them and understand them. So I breezed through college, went straight ahead to grad school, finished grad school at 25 and got my PhD. And then I collapsed into a really horrible case of burnout immediately after. It was that February of 2014, I defended my dissertation. And right after that, I got struck with this really terrible flu that just would not go away. I was getting a fever every single night around 6 or 7 p.m., usually at night. I would get 102, 103-degree fever, sometimes out of nowhere, sweating in like 90-degree heat in the summer. This lasted all the way from February of that year through to November of that same year. Really exhausted, really unable to work other than, just the bare bones basics of some of the duties I had in the psychology lab where I was working, 1 or 2 days a week. I could basically get work done. And it really was forcing me to, at a point in my life where I was graduating and I was supposed to be thinking about starting my career, it really forced me to reevaluate what the future held for me. Um, for the academics in the room, applying to jobs is itself a full-time job for academics. You have to apply to dozens, if not hundreds of positions sometimes. And I just could not do it. And I couldn't envision myself having a life on the tenure track as a researcher and all of these things that had been kind of pre-written for me in grad school as what your fate is and what you should be aspiring to do. So I ended up really dramatically having to cut back the obligations in my life, the pace that I lived at. I was still trying to work, as I mentioned, while dealing with these fevers. I had a heart murmur. I had really severe anemia and all of these medical tests trying to figure out what the source of all of these problems were. And ultimately, the only solution that we really arrived at was that I just needed to rest really dramatically for a long period of time and re-nourish myself and never really work at that pace that I had been working at when I was in grad school ever again. And it was around that time, one of the few jobs that I could kind of manage as I was slowly starting to build up my energy again was part-time teaching at colleges throughout Chicago. And I was teaching at the place that I now am at, the School of Continuing Professional Studies, which is all adult learners. And I was coping with having a new vision of myself as somebody who was slow, tired, maybe even lazy. And I had all these students who were really reflecting back at me those same kind of views of themselves. They were adults who maybe they had tried to go to college on the quote unquote conventional timeline, but it hadn't worked out for them. Some of them hadn't known at that time that they had ADHD or autism or some, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, something else. Some of them had kids, some of them had elder care responsibilities. Most of them had full-time jobs, and they had all of them this insecurity and this need to prove themselves to me and their other instructors that they were really serious about school this time, that they weren't lazy, that they weren't failures, that they were going to do their best. And it seemed so unjust to me that this incredibly hardworking group of people who had far more on their plate than any other body of students I'd ever had were somehow convinced that they were lazy and had gotten that message drilled into them time and time again by teachers when they were kids, parents, people in their life who couldn't understand why they couldn't juggle it all. And so those sets of experiences really got me interested in laziness and writing about just how nonsensical the idea of laziness really is. And so that was an essay that I wrote at that point in time, just from the perspective as a researcher and educator, saying laziness is this value judgment that a person isn't doing the amount that we think they should be doing. But how are we from the outside in a position to judge that? And why would we ever assume that somebody is disappointing others or themselves on purpose? It doesn't really make sense. And that essay connected with a lot of people because I think a lot of us have various different pathways to feeling these things. And then that became the focus of a lot of my work and writing really ever since.
Yeah, because I feel like you get a lot of people who work really hard seem to internalize this idea that if they're not working at all times and putting every single ounce of their energy into doing something that is deemed productive, then they must be lazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I've been diving into some of the latest burnout research lately, even, past publication of this book. And what we're really finding is the people who suffer from burnout the most at the most highest rates and the most pronounced cases of burnout are people who, in one review by Van Dam, basically he said that burnout sufferers suffer from an excess of perseverance. That basically people who are really, really worn down, and I think we can put a lot of disabled people in this category because we push ourselves past the brink of what's comfortable for us. That is where we really burn out. And we see in people in that situation, they usually can't relax. They can't appreciate vacations or breaks or holidays. They can't really rest even when they're trying to rest because their mind is constantly searching for ways in which you're inadequate, basically, and work to do to justify your existence.
Right, and I would also assume that folks that find themselves in the disability community are, in addition to doing all the things that folks normally are doing, they're also potentially masking as well and devoting energy to putting on a mask to portray to the rest of the world how they think that they should look, which takes even more energy.
Yes. In the book, I talk a little bit about how some of the groups that get pathologized as lazy the most frequently are typically the people who are juggling the most. So another example that I talk about is unhoused people, stereotyped as lazy. Why won't they just get a job? But if you've ever actually been close to somebody who's been unhoused, you know it is a full-time job just to find a safe place to, or relatively safe place to sleep at night, hauling around all your possessions, dealing with caseworker meetings, applying for benefits, waiting in line at shelters. And the same thing is true for us disabled folks. We all basically have a part or full-time job as our own case manager, handling our doctor's appointments, insurance, testing, everything, and being expected also to kind of put a brave face on it and not meet the public stereotype of the lazy, fake, disabled person. And so then we try to keep our homes super clean so we don't look lazy and slobby. We try to make sure that we present and how we dress in a way that looks like we have it together. We try to take on as much work as we can. Or if we can't work, we often try to meet other people's emotional or social needs so that we're still valued. And so the pressure is just really unrelenting from a bunch of different sides.
Absolutely. And so maybe we could maybe we could back up a step and talk about how you define the laziness lie that a lot of us internalize. Uh, could you spend a few moments just describing what the laziness lie is?
Yeah. So the laziness lie is my kind of term for a set of tacit cultural beliefs that most of us in, the US, Canada, Europe, I mean, really it's been exported basically everywhere at this point. A set of views about productivity and human value kind of under capitalism that most of us implicitly believe, even if we've never been explicitly told them. And the laziness lie has three tenets. The first is that a person's worth is defined by their productivity in a very real way, like your humanity under capitalism is defined by what you do and produce that has value for others. The second tenet is that you cannot trust your needs and limitations because those are a barrier to your productivity. So you have to really argue with your hunger, argue with your sleepiness, try and see if it even makes sense. Do you really deserve that rest? And interrogate it or ignore it as much as possible because it threatens your capacity to be productive. And then the final tenet of the laziness lie is that there's always more that you could be doing. So even if you are by some means meeting expectations at work, no, you really need to be exceeding expectations. We all know that kind of weird inconsistency in performance reviews. Doing the job isn't enough. You need to exceed expectations. And even if you're doing that, is your house clean enough? Are you signing your kids up for enough extracurriculars? Are you working out enough? Are you volunteering enough? There's an endless litany of social expectations that you are never going to be able to meet entirely on your own because no one is actually that energetic and independent. And so this system of beliefs keeps people forever blaming themselves and feeling inadequate.
Right. I've never met anyone that has said, "Yes, I have done all the things. I am done." It's all there is always seems to be something more that you feel like you need to do in order to be the person that everyone expects you to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really speaks to the point that disability is both a very real medical, biological phenomenon, and it's also a social consequence of the way that we structure society. There's certainly a spectrum of how much a person is disabled or what they're capable of and what they're not. But we really can't say that anybody in the society meets our standard for the independent, productive adult. No person can keep their house clean, keep their fridge stocked full of food, cook all their meals, raise their kids on their own, work a full-time job. We are all, to some extent, disabled by that expectation because that's just not how humans work. We rely upon each other and we are animals with bodies that do all kinds of different challenging, unpredictable things.
Maybe you could speak a bit more about not only is uh, laziness not really a concept except something that society has kind of created, but maybe you could speak to the value of laziness itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, laziness, the way I think most of us use it and have it used against us, comes with this really strong moral judgment, right? That you're not behaving adequately, that you're not doing work that you need to be doing. And it makes it impossible for us to really tap into any actual feelings we have that we label as laziness because we're just kind of dismissing those emotions or those bodily signals as not legitimate, as a threat. So we don't listen to them. But if we kind of take that evaluation off of it and just kind of ask ourselves, what is happening when a person feels lazy, feels tired, feels unfocused? There's so many different things that it signals that are really valuable for our body's self-regulation systems. So one type of laziness is the laziness that we maybe get at the middle of the workday. Anybody else here who works from home uh, or has some kind of office job that requires a lot of cognitive work, but maybe not necessarily a lot of physical work. I think you know that sensation of, for me, it's, 2 or 3 p.m. My eyes are just burning and I don't want to do any more things. But of course, I tell myself that I should, that I need to. And what we find is that when people feel really unfocused at work and they can't complete work tasks, that's first of all typical of the average worker. Productivity research shows time and time again that the average person can really only focus on really cognitively intensive tasks for 3 to 4 hours per day, max. So the 8 hour workday is just completely unscientific. And when people do feel unfocused, lazy, not driven, they can, throw coffee at the problem and throw guilt and shame at the problem, but they get diminishing returns. They produce less work the more they force themselves to just stay at the desk and keep working. So that's one thing that laziness can signal, is that you're just at the end of the focus that you have for a challenging task for that day. And it's time to just go do something different. I think a lot of times when people feel lazy on that level, what's really happening is their body and their brain is crying out for some social stimulation, for them to get out of their environment, take a walk around the block, cuddle with their cat, do something different that is regulating for the whole nervous system and that our bodies need. And if you just look at how most humans have structured their days throughout history, we weren't just sitting in one place doing one task all day long. We were talking, we were making food, we were, picking berries, we were searching the environment, we were chilling, we were talking and telling stories, all these different things. And that seems to be, for the most part, how most of us are wired to operate. Then obviously there's laziness or lazy feelings that are far less fleeting, exhaustion, depression. A lot of times when we get really tired, it is because our body is fighting some kind of battle and it really needs as many resources as we can put towards that battle. So depressed people sleep a lot because that's one way to keep from hurting yourself. It's very protective. And it also typically means that your cognitive functioning is really strained when you're depressed. And so you do need more psychological recovery, and sleep helps with that. The same thing was true with my physical illness. I needed a ton of rest and to do things that were not challenging, at least not in a stressful way. I spent a lot of that year that I was sick playing video games, watching YouTube videos, sitting on the couch, and that was what I had capacity for. And I think that's what a lot of us experience. Um, so a lot of times laziness is the body and the brain really just screaming for us to slow down. It can be a warning sign that a more severe burnout or health event is on the horizon. And then finally, I guess the last realm where people can look lazy or get labeled as lazy is when they just don't see the value of a demand that's being presented to them. So that can be everything from, your stereotypical student who doesn't want to study statistics because nobody's really articulated to them in a convincing way why it's important that they study it. Or it can be somebody who's politically disenfranchised, right? Like, are American voters lazy when they don't go to the polls? Or do we have the most frequent elections in the world, the longest campaign seasons in the world, and all of these other structural issues, that make it demotivating to vote and feel like your vote isn't heard? Almost anytime you see people kind of dragging their feet metaphorically and not meeting our standards of here's how I think this person should act, there's always some piece of the context that's missing. Either their needs aren't being met, something's lacking for them, they need more support and rest, or they're not getting anything out of that task that's being demanded of them, which again is also a structural issue. It's not a personal failing.
Right. So what's interesting is one of the points you even made at the beginning about how mental effort is more demanding and you have less hours in the day that you can devote to that type of work. And it feels like there has been a shift, at least over the past number of years, from more physical jobs to more mentally demanding jobs. Have you seen anything in research to indicate that the trends are correlated, that burnout is correlated with the shift?
Well, there's a couple of different factors that come into play there. Certainly, a physically taxing job can burn a person out and have all those consequences. But I think there's a couple of different aspects to how our economy has changed that really puts people on the road to burnout. So people are working in more socially isolated circumstances and more kind of alienated circumstances where you're on a computer, maybe in an office, maybe at home. A lot of the work you're doing is really solitary, but you're still kind of forced to clock in at specific hours and look active on Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever. So it puts people in this difficult position where they're having to pantomime productivity or be available to their jobs at all times, even while doing the kinds of intellectual work that we know from research a person really can't do for 8 hours per day. And it's much better for most workers in the kind of in that kind of segment of the economy to work at their own pace and work on flex time. Generally, what works for you to get things done is what works for you. You don't really need to be corralled into certain hours to kind of force you to do that for most people. But when you're forced to both do the kind of intellectually productive work and seem busy during certain hours of the day, that is really additionally grueling. And it also means people have to put up this false performance. And we see from research also that when people are doing work that just feels inauthentic to them, they can't feel like they can bring their full self to work, that they have to kind of fake it. That is itself a major predictor of burnout. Another really big predictor of burnout is feeling like your work isn't valued or that you aren't valued or that you're just doing this kind of thankless task that never ends. And for a lot of different reasons, we've moved towards more gig economy work. Employees are treated as a lot more replaceable now than in generations past. A lot of us are kind of in that work circumstance where we both have a ton of work to do. We're expected to work on a particular schedule, even if it doesn't work for us. And whatever work we do, it's often feels very thankless and unrewarded. And so those things, and we might also be doing it in complete isolation at home, which most humans are social creatures and we benefit from feeling like we're doing something that matters around other people who value us. So when you don't have those elements, burnout is way more likely. And I think we're really seeing that reflected in a lot of people's mental health today. Yeah.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I see examples even in my workplace, um, just of individuals that will need to socialize more and will not be as able to do the work that maybe they used to do before. And that's just I guess the what you would label the general population. And so it sounds like a lot of the things that you're mentioning, these are things that are that we see happening more in society, in the workplace, probably especially with COVID.
Yeah, yeah. COVID, I think for disabled people, the changes that COVID has wrought have been both a blessing and a curse, right? Like we have a lot more accessible events. I mean, here I am, like most conferences that I get to speak to can accommodate that I usually can't travel, and that's amazing. But also it has led to really, really intense isolation for a lot of people. A lot of people feel less confident in their social skills because of lockdown, and people who are really socially motivated, which is a really large segment of the population, maybe even the majority of human beings, it's really hard for them to stay focused and motivated and to feel like anything they're doing is even real in a sense if all you're doing it is from your home office every day and you're not getting breaks to kind of bond with your coworkers or work on something together so you get that sense of reward that wow, we did this thing together and now it's paying off. A lot of us in our work, we really just don't get that sensation that much anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how have you seen as folks start to label themselves as lazy? How do you see that impact their ability to ask for help, especially maybe with a chronic illness?
It's a really huge barrier. And for people who are disabled or have chronic illnesses, there's already so many barriers to help seeking. First of all, there just aren't enough resources, whether it's medical supports, home health aides, even our family members just don't have enough time because they're working their butts off too. So there's already enough barriers in place that make it really difficult for a disabled person to seek support. and maybe we'll probably eventually the conversation will get to this as well, just the suspicion of anybody with a disability claim in our social welfare system. Like applying for benefits is very difficult. It's based on this assumption that people are fakers trying to game the system. And so you have to have all of these medical reports proving that you actually are disabled. And then you have to reprove it sometimes as frequently as every 6 months to keep those benefits. So that's already the cultural soup that all of us with disabilities are kind of marinating in, all of this doubt and scrutiny. And most of us internalize that and really feel a need to prove that we are doing everything that we can to meet our own needs and to try and get better. So I think that's one of the first ways that we see this internalization appear for a lot of disabled people is first the pursuit of getting better, the idea that we can return to a state of hyperproductivity or abledness, whatever our highest kind of peak was in the past, thinking that we'll be able to restore ourselves to that level and feeling inadequate anytime we don't meet that standard. When the reality is, many of our disabilities either get worse or get more complicated over time, and we're all aging. And so, for the most part, we're all going to lose productive capacity over time, regardless. And so it's something we kind of have to make peace with. It's very hard to make peace with in our culture. So you see a lot of people aspiring towards meeting this mystical time before when they weren't as disabled, when that's probably not attainable for most people. You see a lot of people with chronic illness because of scrutiny and doubt. Sometimes people wish that they could almost get bad enough for their struggle to be seen as legitimate by other people. And of course, nobody actually wants to get worse, to be in more pain, to find things harder, but they want it to be visible and obvious enough to others that people will finally actually respect it. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily always work out that way. Sometimes people get more angry with you the more that you need. Certainly, a lot of the kind of guilting messages that get put on us from sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes not so well-intentioned friends and loved ones, trying everything, have you tried yoga? Have you tried this? Have you tried this diet? Pouring lots of money into anything that offers like a promise of a cure, regardless of whether we believe in it or not. And as I kind of alluded to before, another thing that you really see is trying to meet the needs of others. So if we can't physically work, then we want to be the emotional anchor for our family, or we want to do lots of volunteer work. A lot of times, those of us who find out kind of later in life that we're disabled, then we make disabled advocacy our thing and kind of reach like activist fatigue and burnout from doing that stuff. So that's also another way that it manifests. There's a lot of different ways that people in our communities really guilt themselves, really understandably feel a need to prove themselves as worthy of seeking help, and that means we often burn ourselves out worse. And I think that sometimes also takes the form of us not even knowing what kind of help to ask for or what is possible for us. Um, it's really difficult to just say, "Hey, can you pick me up some groceries? Can you come, just be in the room while I fold my laundry because I can't focus on it when I'm alone." These really small gestures that I think a lot of people actually do want to provide for one another and find it fulfilling. Again, going back to that idea that we're social creatures, like we do actually want to support one another. It's really, really hard for a lot of us to even articulate that we want those kinds of things.
That makes total sense. I think many of the things that you mentioned resonate, right? Like from the fact that many people who have gone down the road of applying for disability, it takes a lot of effort, and I know a lot of people in our community have gone down that road, and it is more difficult to demonstrate sometimes. And then there's the whole battle of someone telling you and being adversarial and saying, clearly you don't have this, when you know you do. And even asking for help as well. So given all of this, what do you think, do you have recommendations or ideas to try to help us stop internalizing the idea of laziness and kind of move us out of that cycle?
Yeah, I think what a person should do in that realm, it kind of depends first on where you're at. I think if you're really at that stage that kind of I described myself being in when I was sick, and that I think a lot of us reach when we're burned out or we're newly reaching the point where we find out we have a disability. A lot of people in those kind of early stages, the first thing that you can do is really just rest a ton, as much as is humanly possible. And yes, you're probably going to have that internal critic and external ones. Let's not lie, telling you that you shouldn't be doing that, and learning to just let those voices exist and still do what you need to do anyway is a major challenge. But I think it's an important starting point. Another thing that I really often encourage people to do is to keep track of, for a week or a couple of days, keep track of how you actually spend your time, not in an aspirational way of here's what's on my to-do list, but here's how I actually spend my days. Here are the patterns and the rhythms of my days. And then use that as your, not even necessarily baseline, but let your expectations for yourself and your understanding of yourself flow from that, because nothing predicts future behavior quite like most recent past behavior. So rather than setting expectations for yourself based on how productive you think you should be, again, let it be informed by what you actually are capable of, which is really difficult and very threatening to do. A huge component of overcoming these fears of laziness and this exhaustion that most of us are dealing with is cutting back a lot of life obligations. That's the hard one. That's the big one. That's why most of us are pushing ourselves too hard. Um, and it can feel like it's completely non-negotiable because, again, under capitalism, you have to work to eat. And so you have to really make some really tough decisions often. And, this book is just full of people who have left jobs, switched to part-time work. I have a sequel to my book on autism coming out next year that's all about profiling the various ways that autistic people start to restructure our lives once we really reach that point of deciding my life needs to work with my disability rather than against it. And so, that book is chock full of examples of people who moved in together with other disabled people to cut down on living expenses. Maybe they trade childcare with one person who works, so then they don't have to work a day job and they can kind of lean on each other. And everything from that to people who decide to live on houseboats or in vans or um, live in really dramatically different ways from what is offered to us as kind of the capitalist ideal of you're going to be a homeowner and you're going to have 2.5 kids and be independent and all of those things. Um, and there are really massive sacrifices that come with all of that and losses to grieve. So, for me, it was abandoning the idea of ever being a tenure track professor or doing research on the pace that my colleagues were doing. And uh, and even that kind of has to be reevaluated and reset every couple of years because I like writing, but doing a book tour really burned me out. And so now I have to really be really careful about what I do, where I go, how often I travel, what talks I give, and things like that, and kind of ratcheting back how involved I am. And I recognize how privileged I am to be able to make those choices, and those are great problems to have. Um, and unfortunately, the reality is for a lot of people in our communities, the choices that they have to make are: how am I going to stay fed? Am I going to get on disability? Is there someone in my life that I can ask for support so that they can help me, either financially or help me with the logistics of getting on benefits? And how am I going to live my life at a much slower and often more modest pace so that I can follow the speed of my own body? Our society is not structured for that. So I don't want to ever talk about it as if it's a personal failure or that it's yet another thing that you have to or that you should have to come up with your own individual solution for. It's a failure of our society that we even have to think that way about living in a van instead of having a house that is safe and comfortable for you to live in because you can't work a full-time job and afford to pay for it. Like, it's horrible that people make those decisions. But often that is what I see a lot of disabled people. The world as it currently is not structured for us. The life paths that are laid out for most people are not followable for us. And so that does mean we end up inventing a lot of our own paths. and working together to kind of build new networks of support, which can be very beautiful when it works out and when it comes together in this new interdependent way. But it's horrible that we have to make those kinds of decisions and make those kinds of sacrifices. And grief is a huge part of moving through that as well.
Yeah, we see a lot of one of the hardest pieces is kind of accepting the new you and adapting to the new you.
Yeah.
Would you have recommendations on some of the self-talk that we might have as we're thinking about, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing this other thing? I've a lot of the value judgments that we internalize.
I think, surrounding yourself with other disabled people and seeing their struggles reflect your own can do a lot to kind of quiet that voice of judgment. I think also not setting the goal of I need to stop thinking these terrible thoughts about myself paradoxically can actually be a good way to kind of move through it with acceptance. Because I think sometimes if we hear that voice that's yelling at us that we're lazy, that we're not doing enough, that we need to try something else, it's really unpleasant. And so, of course, we want to just like shut that out and repress it, which can often have a rebound effect. That the thoughts you're trying to repress or suppress, they'll often come back even louder. And looking at that voice, one thing that's helpful for me and for a lot of people is recognizing that that is a voice that represents society's judgments and other people's take on us. It's not a reflection of our true self and our true values. So that voice can still exist in your head and you can know where it comes from and say, okay, that isn't me. I might always hear it from time to time. I might never get it to completely go away because I still live in a culture that is bombarding me with all this guilt. So, yes, sometimes I'm going to hear that guilting voice and I can just kind of accept that it's there and really tune back into what I actually value and what I actually believe. So that's a big piece in a lot of my work is really encouraging people to orient towards what do you value most in life? Um, is it community? Is it art? Is it family? Is it, like, is it being of service to others in the ways that are actually sustainable for you? Is it nature? We all have things that really do reflect who we are on that kind of higher, kind of more ascended level, what we value, what's important for us. The things that, if nothing else in life is sustainable, if everything is collapsing, this is what's most important to me. And I think remembering that that's what we stand for can really help us kind of reorient towards, okay, yes, part of me is saying I should be signing up for every request that's made of me. I should be taking on more work. I should be doing more volunteering and for every cause in the world, but that's not possible. What do I actually value? Let me check back in with what I know consistently is the most important to me and is hopefully if it's something you value, there's ways to engage with that thing that are actually galvanizing and reviving and give you energy and a sense of purpose and aren't just a source of guilt and stress all of the time. So tuning back into those things that actually make you feel like you're in the right place, that you're where you need to be, and that you're already enough. Those kinds of pursuits are really the places where your attention can go instead of all of those constant shoulds and guilts and shame that unfortunately sometimes, yeah, we are going to feel in this world.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of times something that we might beat ourselves up for if it was happening to one of our friends or one of the people that we know that has IH, we'd be like, what are you doing? You're doing awesome. You're doing all of these things. What do you mean you're feeling this way? But like you you aren't lazy. Look at everything that you're doing and all the great things that you're doing. And so being
Yeah,
fair
and
to yourself. Sorry.
sorry, no, and all that you're dealing with. I was just going to say, like, we discount how much we're juggling all of those small daily, like, hidden labors. And, like, we deserve credit for every little bit of that.
Well, I think at this point, why don't we go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience? Just a piece of logistics, Dr. Price. We will have to mute the podium mic as we pass around the mic, and we will only have one so that we don't get any echo or feedback from the room. So you may not hear me. I might go back and forth, but I will hand off to questions right now.
Dr. Price, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hi.
Wonderful. Hello. Your message, I just want to say, feels so validating and is really resonating with the people here in our live audience as well as online. You're getting a lot of love online in the Q&A, so thank you so much. Selfishly, I had a quick question for you. I love that you said laziness is a value judgment. During your research, did you have any sense of where this value judgment began in history? And kind of along that same line, does your country of origin as an individual impact the value judgment that you may hold about yourself as it relates to laziness?
Yeah. So this is a decent chunk of the beginning of the book. Where does this laziness lie come from? Where does this hatred of lazy come from? So at one point, I kind of dive into the etymology of where laziness comes from. And it has two root words, an old Middle German word, Lasich, which means feeble or weak, and then an Old English lesu, which means false or evil. So those two things combined, you're weak, but you're lying about it, are basically kind of combined in the term lazy. So it's been with us for as long as the word's been in English. But in Laziness Does Not Exist, I really track it to kind of the rise of Puritanism and how useful moral puritanism was as an ideology as colonization was happening. So so the Puritans were kind of in England religious radicals for their time, which is part of why they were sent over to the American colonies as it was newly being colonized as kind of outcasts. And they had a really extreme point of view that that any act of charity morally corrupted a person, that if you helped someone when they were struggling, you were making them more morally weak, and so that was a bad thing to do. That people who were hardworking were chosen by God to and were already blessed. Basically, it wasn't that you earned your way into heaven through hard work. The Puritans really believed that there are people out in the world who are blessed, who have that hardworking spirit, and those are good people. And then there are people who you can't rely on, people who are lazy, people who are struggling, and those people are evil or tainted in some way. And anything that makes them weaker is doing them a disservice and making them even more evil. So you can't give them charity, you can't give them any support. People need to just be judged by the merits of their own energy and work. And though that was kind of a fringe point of view in England at that point in time, I think as colonization was happening, it was a very useful ideology to use to justify things like indentured servitude and slavery, because this land was being conquered and indigenous people were being driven off this land by primarily poor settlers and indentured servants who were brought over here with the promise of economic prosperity, but then were kind of forced to work for a very low wage. And then, of course, much of this country was shaped by enslaved people who were being forced to work just outright forever. And so, a Christian ideology that the hardworking are the blessed and the virtuous, and people who don't agree to work are evil, was a very politically useful ideology for forcing people to work in both those cases. And from there, the hatred of laziness really kind of took hold in our culture when slavery was abolished and reparations were kind of being negotiated politically. There were political cartoons in the late 1800s portraying Black Americans as lazy for wanting reparations. That same depiction of the person seeking support is lazy was then turned on disabled people in the 20th century. And that's where we kind of get the idea of disabled people being fakers who are trying to game the system and get disability when they don't deserve it. Then, as we head into kind of the Reagan 80s, we had the welfare queen kind of scare of basically portraying single women, again, predominantly Black, were the ones portrayed as this, as lazy for needing government benefits to help take care of their families. It's been this really incredibly useful, sticky political tool to say anyone who society has failed and excluded or oppressed is lazy and complaining too much and trying to take advantage and trying to get a handout. And we still very much see that with us today. And I don't think there's really any marginalized group of people who doesn't internalize that message to some extent. And to speak to your other question about kind of cross-cultural comparisons, I'm telling the story of American colonization because it's the one that we all, for the most part in this room, know the best. But if you look at colonization in Australia or colonization in Africa, anywhere throughout the world, it's been touched by very similar ideologies and processes for the most part. And people have that baggage. And I've this book has been translated into a lot of languages. I've heard from people throughout the world, and I won't pretend to be an expert on every culture and how it manifests, but the message that I've consistently heard from people is that they resonate with it even if their culture's take on it is framed in a slightly different way. So in a country where that's a little bit less individualistic than the US, laziness might be hated in the way of you're letting down your family, you're letting down your community by not working hard enough. But even if that's the narrative people are getting from it in some other countries, they're still essentially getting the message that you are not doing enough, you're defective, and you need to ask for less. So it's manifested in slightly different ways, but it seems to be an almost universal, at least in terms of like industrialized kind of capitalist countries, the way that it looks is eerily similar across the world at this point.
Hi, my name is Candace. Can you hear me also?
Yeah, hi.
Okay. I have IH and major depression disorder. I was diagnosed with IH at 18. I'm now 32. I've had it as early as third grade that I remember. With my depression, I currently, as of a month ago, I'm not working and I'm actually doing a program for it. But my question, I guess, is you've touched all around like laziness, depression, differentiating between different disabilities. What advice would you give to somebody in my situation that not necessarily was in denial of depression, but maybe naive to it because I've had IH for so long, a lot of the symptoms overlap. And I didn't realize until it was almost too late that I was in a major depression. So do you have any additional advice for people dealing with that situation?
Yeah, I think I could definitely speak to how stealthy depression can often be. Um, a lot of people really don't realize how sometimes seemingly functional you can be while being depressed for a really long period of time. And I think it's particularly hard to untangle when you have other disabilities that are obviously affecting your energy and what looks like your motivation levels and all of those things. We see this in a lot of autistic people too, where we might not necessarily realize we're depressed because we're just irritable all the time. And, we're trying to meet certain obligations, but we resent every single one of them. And maybe life was already so kind of unpleasant for us because of things like sensory issues that it's really hard to tell when you reach the depression point of no longer experiencing joy from daily life events because maybe you kind of weren't that much anyway because daily life is just really painful for you. So it's a really hard thing to untangle. And I think that can make you just really caring for oneself when you are experiencing depression really hard. So a lot of the advice I would have is stuff that I'm sure you're probably already beginning to embark on, especially like seeking treatment and kind of grappling with this stuff and having a point of awareness of it now. I think and I apologize if I become a broken record because I often talk about community as being part of a solution, but talking to other depressed people, other people who have comorbidities, not even necessarily just depression and IH, but people who have different mental illnesses or disabilities that are comorbid with depression in their lives, because it is such a tricky beast, these things. Like the way that they manifest is shaped by our beliefs, the culture we're in, whatever else we're dealing with. And so it is never as simple as this checklist that just says, oh, I skipped a meal 2 days in a row. I might be getting depressed. It's so much harder to actually figure it out because the brain that is doing the figuring it out is affected by the thing. And so it feels like objective reality. when you're in it. So, for me, getting as many other people's narratives of what they're going through and what it looks like has always been so helpful, just endlessly helpful. Whether that's support groups, meeting other people, online kind of community groups, reading books and memoirs, and really just kind of sitting with it. Again, this is something that you've probably already internalized so well a million times having IH, but just trying as much to just trust your body and brain when it's telling you that it needs support and rest. It's really difficult to actually validate that to the extent that it deserves to be validated, because again, we get so much guilting. And I think also just kind of be mindful that a lot of psychiatric treatment still has a really long way to go, especially for people with other disabilities. So if there is something that a therapist says to you that just does not quite connect in the right way, or if in any kind of mental health institution you feel like things are moving too fast, you're being pushed to do something you don't want to do, you don't understand what's being asked of you, or you just feel really like intimidated by the authority that's kind of breathing down your neck, like notice that and bring with you a degree of skepticism, because a lot of times these treatment programs were made for a kind of stock, almost imaginary kind of patient, the patient who only has depression in mind. And that's not our human reality. A lot of times, even professionals who know how to treat depression, they don't necessarily know about IH. They don't necessarily know about autism or ADHD, or how to meet the needs of queer people, or they might not know enough about just different cultural narratives on depression, and they might unwittingly be racist or xenophobic without meaning to. Like, we have this one size fits all kind of treatment plan for a lot of mental health stuff that overlooks the complexity of who we are. So I think it's good to be aware of that and to know that the people treating you are not infallible. And again, if you have a condition like IH, you've probably had like bad doctors and lackluster medical providers and had to do a lot of self-advocacy before. So maybe you're old hat at that. I'm sure many in the room are, but I think it always bears mentioning, like, it's okay to have questions or doubts, or to realize this treatment program, this type of therapy, this medication, it isn't working for me. And to say that, or to seek out other opinions, and to make sure that you're always looping in your disabled community with you in figuring out this stuff, because sometimes what works for an abled person in mental health treatment is not going to work for us, and it could backfire. And so as much as you can kind of connect all of those threads and get support and perspectives from people who've been in both those worlds, I think the better positioned you'll be to be able to self-advocate and find out what works for you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price. I know we only have about 2 minutes left, so we'll try to get a couple more questions in. One of our online attendees, Dr. Price, is wondering about any advantages versus disadvantages of self-disclosing a disability to an employer. Do you have any suggestions or ideas around that?
Oh, I have a ton of writing about this. It's a subject that is very complicated. And my next book that comes out next year also touches on this for autistic people in particular, but I think that applies to a lot of different communities. The first thing I want to say is that even though in theory, discrimination against disabled people is illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act, what we find is in 90% of lawsuits on the matter, the employer wins, not the disabled person. So even though it's in theory supposed to be not allowed for you to be passed over for a promotion because you're disabled, passed over for a job because you're disabled, the data shows that it's really hard to prove that's what's happened in a court of law. And so the deck is often stacked against us. And I say that so people have realistic expectations. And I'm typically always banging on the drum that you can't trust your employer, no matter what they say about valuing, diversity or mental health or what have you. I always kind of keep a little skepticism in you with regard to that. Disclosing disability is it's a complicated thing. Even seeking out formal diagnosis is a complicated thing, because when something is on your chart, it can influence how medical providers look at you and treat you in all kinds of ways. So I always encourage people to really study up on the situation and also be very observant. So if it's a workplace, really see if you can get the temperature of that workplace and see how other people are being treated for not quote unquote meeting standards, for having any kind of disability. How are marginalized people treated there? How are racial justice issues treated in your workplace? Get a sense of how safe is it to be a person who diverges from that really narrow norm, and get additional supports if you can. Far better than individual disability discrimination claims in the workplace. What seems to work far better is unions. We find that in organized, unionized workplaces, disabled people are far less likely to be retaliated against or fired. They earn higher wages. They're more likely to get the accommodations they need. A lot of times, getting the supports we need, unfortunately, because it's more complicated, it has to be almost a collective matter rather than an individual act of self-advocacy. And we just live in an era right now where a lot of workplace diversity and inclusion initiatives have started to include disability and mental health. And so a lot of employers will say that they want to accommodate employees. And so that's why I really like to warn people that you can't always believe them when they say that. Look at how other workers are being treated, talk with other workers at your organization about their problems, or if it's school, talk to your classmates about problems you're having. When we work together to advocate, we tend to have far better outcomes than if we just put ourselves in a really vulnerable place of saying, here's this really stigmatized fact about me. Please don't discriminate against me for it. Unfortunately, a lot of times we do still get discriminated against for it. I hate to have to say it, but that's really what a lot of the data shows. Yeah.
Hi, Claudia Parker. I know we're running a bit low on time here. I don't have an elegant way to really bridge these two things, so I'd just like to present like a little vignette of an experience I have and then just the concept as well. I was doing a sort of part-time physical labor sort of job, and I was at the end of the workday one day, and I had full permission from my employer to take whatever rest I needed. Everything was already wrapped up. We had one person left there being taken care of, so I went and laid down, had a breather. I'm, narcoleptic, cataplectic, all that fun stuff. And upon noticing me, they walked over, clapped as loud and as hard as they could in my ear, and went, "Hey, you're slacking off. You get up, girl." I was like, well, the workday's over, and I'm narcoleptic. I have permission to lay down. So just the idea of this aggression I've noticed towards people, not just who are disabled, but just resting in general. I noticed this weird sense of anger towards people who are resting. I feel like this really feeds into the whole laziness concept, this anger towards people who are perceived as being lazy, not pulling their weight. And then again, just this other concept, I wasn't sure how to bridge into it, the psychosocial weight of having to be like a perfect patient. So not only, as you'd mentioned, you have to advocate for yourself, you're basically being your own case manager, you have to keep all your medical documentation. I have a binder full of receipts and information and notes and all sorts of mess. I have all sorts of handouts. I have a whole, what is it called? Portfolio full of this stuff at this point, just trying to figure out what's going on with me. The concept of you have to do everything perfectly. You have to be sure you're always taking your meds on time. You have to be sure you're always doing all the things that people say can help you. And if you're not, then you're a failure because you're not being a perfect patient. It's just kind of this lack of empathy and lack of humanity for the idea that nobody can do everything right all the time. But when you're disabled or otherwise have to exist in such a way that means you have to take a lot of extra steps to just function in society, there's definitely this like heavy judgment that I find about, oh, well, if you're really that sick, well, you should be doing this, this, and this. You should never forget to take your meds. You should always be taking your vitamins and always doing research, and just kind of the exhaustion that comes from that.
Mm-hmm. And then if you're perfectly well organized and you have all these binders and documents and proof, then sometimes your doctor will find it suspicious or like you're trying to angle for a particular treatment or diagnosis, and then their authority will feel threatened, and then they'll punish you for that. There's no winning. I think both of the stories that you've kind of just shared right now really speak to conformity pressures and how much like this really narrow definition of how people are supposed to present in public at all times really hurts disabled people, in addition to just the hatred of rest, and seeing that as somehow evil or sinful enough that people would just so mean-spiritedly bully for you for that. But just thinking of it as an autistic person, I've had, people in workplaces reprimand me for how I was sitting in my chair, for like how I was moving my body when it was not disrupting anyone. And certainly for presenting to the doctor, either I'm not showing enough emotion and they don't believe that I'm suffering, or I'm showing too much emotion and they think I'm hysterical and borderline personality disorder and manipulative. Like there is no winning, because what we've societally set down as the acceptable parameters for how a person can be is just impossible to meet. Once somebody starts scrutinizing you, they'll find nothing but flaws, nothing but proof of incapability or insanity or lack. And it just ravages so many of our lives. It's such a hard battle to fight. So thank you for sharing those.
Am I off?
Well, thank you, Dr. Price, for speaking with us today. We really appreciate the time, and let's give up so there are folks asking how we get your book. Laziness Does Not Exist. I believe that's in major book retailers, be it Amazon or other major retailers. Also, your other books are quite good, including the newest one on shame. Would highly recommend that one as well.
Yep. And I know, because this is really popular with disabled people, the audiobooks are also available wherever you get those. Those tend to be people's favorites, actually.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Price. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone.